everyone. Welcome, welcome. Okay, friends. So today we have a really special talk as a part of this talk series that we've been doing at el Seminario de Intersecciones de lo Religioso. And today, in this, relating to this topic, religion, culture, and public life, we're talking about something very specific. The topic of this talk, the name of this talk is Religion, Radicalism, and Polarization, an approach from the youth. So we're going to talk about a topic that has been part of the conversation for several years, but is now more than ever at the center of a lot of controversy, specifically for those of us who study religion, but also those of us who study politics in general. And I think this theme has showed us how public discourse is falling short analyzing the topic, but also academia, like the academy is falling short on our understanding of the topic because we are not super sure on how to approach the theme, how it intersects between religion and also youth in general, how the media, social media, everything impacts radicalization and polarization. So we're very, very happy to have two speakers with us today, Beatriz and Jose Manuel. During this talk, we will start hearing Beatriz, and then she's going to talk about her work on the topic, and then we'll listen to Jose Manuel share some of his perspectives on the topic from his own work. Let me introduce you. Beatriz Rivero da Silva holds a BA degree in Languages and International Relations from the University of Porto and an MA degree in Human Rights and Multi-Level Governance from the University of Padua. She has developed a keen interest in sociology of culture, particularly in the nexus of radicalism and polarization with religious identity. Welcome, Beatriz. Thank you for being here and thank you for sharing your work with us.
Ooh. Thank you so much, Nadia. And thank you for having me. So first, I would like to thank Claxo for the opportunity to take part in this academic intercultural dialogue. And I believe these moments of academic exchange between different cultural and geographical contexts are essential in academia and then should be more frequent. So thank you, David, Nadia, and thank you, Professor Moran. I hope I'm pronouncing it well, your name, for your availability. And I hope we'll have a fruitful and an insightful discussion. So briefly speaking, in my PhD project, I focus on the phenomenon of radicalism through a cultural sociological lens. And my case study is urban youth radicalism, and I'm currently focusing on the Italian city of Milan. So when conceptualizing radicalism, I have identified that in the European academic context, there are two main tendencies. So the first is that there is a conceptual confusion between radicalism and radicalization, as the concepts are often used interchangeably. And secondly, radicalism is often conceptualized also in relation to other social phenomena, such as extremism, terrorism, political activism, which reflects a consolidated political and security framework. So in contrast to the European tendency to frame radicalism through a political and a security lenses, I'm curious to learn if in Latin American contexts, the conceptualization of radicalism is more encompassing. It also touches upon themes such as human rights, religion, social justice, and so on, particularly when considering urban youth radicalism or youth radicalism more generally speaking. So in my work, I do not neglect the political and security framework. I take it into consideration and I seek to expand it. And in the European context, there are many authors who have contributed widely to the topic, such as, for example, Donatella Della Porta, who proposed a relational approach to study radicalization, but also Schmidt, who made the distinction between the historical approach to radicalism, which dates back to the 19th century, that associated radicalism with liberal, anti-clerical, pro-democratic, progressive political positions, whereas nowadays the term assumes the opposite connotation. So it's associated with anti-liberal, anti-democratic, and regressive stances, and it is often linked to radical Islamism. And then there are also authors who have made a distinction between activism and radicalism, with activism being characterized as legal political action and radicalism as illegal political action. And these are Moskalenko and Macaulay. So I've taken all these insights into consideration, and I've asked myself, does radicalism always include a political ideology? Are we sure of this? Can radicalism also be aesthetic, religious, spiritual, performative? And who in civil society decides that radicalism is violent for social integration, and in which context? Is radicalism something inevitable in modernity? And what I've realized is that current theoretical frameworks are insufficient to answer these questions, as radicalism's complexity is often reduced to pathology. And what I do in my current work is I argue that cultural sociology might be able to provide a good lens to study radicalism, because it is a meaning-centered sociology. It tries to understand, in other words, which symbols, performances, and collective representations are at the basis of radicalism. And in my work, I use the civil sphere theory by Jeffrey Alexander to read radicalism, which is a theory that holds that solidarity is a relationship at the basis of civil sphere, and that this solidarity is articulated symbolically through the main civil sphere institutions, which are regulative and communicative institutions. So from a theoretical point of view, this is my starting point in my research. I then include a micro-sociological lens in the project by introducing urban youth radicalism in Europe as a case study. And currently, to explore these dynamics more concretely, I focus on urban youth radicalism in Milan, which is considered the most European Italian city. And in Milan, there are expressions of urban youth radicalism, which are very contemporary and intersect with religion, arts, aesthetics, culture, politics. I have to say that I have not yet begun my field research, but I have identified some groups which will be the core of my research. So I will list them now. If you want to ask me questions about it later, you can for sure. These groups are the Maranza. So the Maranza in Italy, they are generally identified as a second generation Italian young person. They're almost always male, in many cases of North African origin. They normally use slang, they display some street attitudes, designer and flashy clothes and accessories. And in Italian public opinion, there is a division concerning Maranza. So some people associate them with crime and juvenile delinquency, and some just see them as a parody. Second group are trappers and drillers, so from the trap and drill music scene. Through their lyrics, they sacralize their neighborhoods and their city. And there are many groups from the many youngsters from the Italian trap scene, especially male, who self-identify as Maranza, so the first category I've talked about. And then the third category is second generation Italian youth. So these are young people. They are born in Italy to foreign parents, and in the Italian public opinion, they are often associated with the Islamic presence in Europe. So these are groups very much intersect with each other. They perform exclusion, marginality, identity relationships, and religion is key in these dynamics, both symbolically and as a site of polemic. And what I asked myself in my research, and I will conclude here, is are these groups expanding or enshrining civil sphere boundaries in Milanese and Italian societies? So that was it. And I hope, I also have a question for Professor, but I think that's later, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I mean, you can do whatever you want. If you want to say your question now, that's good too, but we can leave it for the second part of this conversation. Thank you so much, Beatriz. That is super interesting. I want to listen. I want to hear more about these conceptual differences and how they um, change or they operate within different contexts. I'm very excited to hear what you have to say, Jose Manuel. But first, let me introduce you. Jose Manuel Moral found this. It's a PhD, holds a PhD in Latin American social studies and an MA in sociology from La Universidad Nacional de Córdoba. He's a political scientist from La Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile, researcher of the National Scientific Research Council, CONICET, from Argentina. It's also a researcher of the Program of Sexual and Reproductive Rights from the Faculty of Law de la Universidad Nacional de Córdoba. Thank you so much for joining us, Doctor. Welcome, and the floor is yours.
Hey. Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Nadia, and thank you, Beatriz. That was a very interesting presentation. Really, I really love how you present this map of categories or interpretations about what radicalism is in the academy. So I was wondering, I really want to listen more about that, because I think that you're using like a positive notion, a positive idea of radicalism, which I love. But you know, literature is kind of divided here. You know, we have some authors that use the idea of radicalism in a positive way. In political science, you have like Chantal Mouffe, for example, that used this category to speak about radical democracy, which is the ideal of democracy for her work. But on the other side, we have in political science many people many economists that use this word to point out how several, especially far-right groups, are radicalizing their agendas to confront democracy, liberal democracy. You know, so we don't know how to use this word. It has a positive. We have a positive conception of radicalism. We have a negative conception of radicalism. So I really love how you took part of this conversation. But I really want to hear you more about how are you thinking on radicalism when you are thinking this youth, urban youth, radical groups? Why do you think that? What do they have? What is the radical component of these groups? What make them radical from your lens? You end your presentation say that you are trying to find out how these groups, these youth groups, are like expanding the boundaries of public sphere of the community. So I really want to listen. I know that you haven't started your field work, but I really want to hear you about what are you expected to find when you interview them or make your empirical research. Why do you think they are radical, and in which ways they have a radical component that are moving the boundaries of the community, the public sphere, you know? Because I know that, or something that we can think about is, okay, they are involved in a context, the current Italian context, in which a strong religious discourse, a strong religious public discourse is being used by the government to try to show how Italy is, in the way that the government wants to put it, is a kind of homogeneous community marked by Catholic identity, Catholic culture, you know. So I understand that maybe these groups are radical in the sense that, okay, they, with the identity, with the performance, with the identity expressions, they are showing that Italy is not an homogeneous cultural, religious space. In that sense, I understand that they can be radically threaten this Catholic ideal that the government is trying to set. So maybe I want to listen to you. How do you think? How are you understanding radicalism? Because maybe radicalism should be understood in the context, in some context. You know, it's a situational concept. You can understand radicalism without a context. What is radical depends on what context it is situated. So that's one comment and one question I have. What are you thinking about what are you thinking about when you think about radicalism, specifically for these groups? And the other thing is about polarization, which is the other part of your research. Do you think that these groups that you mentioned are groups that are polarizing society, or they are in a context that, in a general context that in which polarization is part of the frame that they are involved? So they are not polarizing society, but society is polarizing itself, using these groups to make this kind of polarization through religious identity. So this is the other question that I have. But again, I really want to listen you again. I really love the way in which you are using the concepts, problematizing them, and I think your research is really in an excellent way. So thank you very much, Beatriz, for your work and your words.
Thank you so much. Can I answer directly, or you're going to? Okay.
Go ahead.
So thank you so much, Professor. So regarding so the first part on radicalism, it was actually a challenge for me when I was conducting my literature review, because most articles talk about radicalism in a more negative way. And especially if you are reading things related to terrorism, etc. And there's also this problem that radicalism is often conflated with radicalization. So I did not say it because I did not have the time, but in my current literature review, I make a distinction between radicalism and radicalization. And I define radicalism as a personal or collective experience, as an attempt to navigate society and to, in a way, find answers to one's existential questions. This can be made through politics, through religion, through culture, art, aesthetics, or any other element that the individual developed a connection to through secondary or tertiary socialization. So through, let's say, radical performances, the subjects give meaning to their social life, and they navigate the complex interaction between, their inner life and society. And they perform this radicalism through elements that speak the most to them in their current life phase. And of course, these actions may be considered breaches in the civil order. They can result in inclusion or exclusion from the civil sphere. It depends on how they interact with civil sphere institutions. And right now, I do not frame radicalism as a static condition or as a process, but more as a relational continuum. So it may include violence, it may not include violence, and it may lead to radicalization or not. I do not think we can exclude the idea that radicalism may lead to radicalization, but they are different things. And radicalization, I conceptualize it as a process. And so yes, there's this difficulty in trying to understand if the concept is positive or negative. I don't like to frame it that way. I think that in social sciences, we have to avoid both pathologizing or romanticizing social phenomena. Like, that is not our job, I do not think. I mean, we analyze the social consequences, political, religious, etc., but we should not be pathologizing a phenomenon. And so regarding youth, so that's how I approach urban youth radicalism, keeping that in mind. And what is the radical component of the groups? So because I consider radicalism beyond politics, so a wide spectrum of actions can be part of what is considered radical. What I see in the Milanese context in Milan is that arts play an important role there. Especially considering trappers and drillers, but all these three groups that I've mentioned, they all intersect with each other. There are people who self-identify in all the three categories, which is quite interesting. Some people may not identify in all categories, but some youth, they do. And I connect this with what you said, with what you asked me about polarization. Are they polarizing society, or are they part of polarizing tendencies? I think that it's more, it can be the first, but it's very much the second. Because if we consider the civil sphere that has both regulative and communicative institutions, I don't know if you followed recent news about Italy, but there were many strikes regarding Palestine and in many Italian cities. And in Milan, what happened is that there was some violence, and some youth, they actually destroyed some windows in Milan's train station. And what the media said is was pro-Pal youth, communist, and Maranza, so the category I'm studying, they are the responsible for this. So actually, Maranza are not that mentioned in the media, but this specific example allows us to see how are they being framed. So they are being conceptualized as radical by the media, but I think that their radicalism may be more aesthetic and more cultural, let's say, because they use music, but the media is framing them in a political way. That's, yes. And for me, what is interesting when I will start my field research is to also see this intersection between Maranza and trappers, because I think in terms of identity, I will find interesting things. There are many trappers who do not identify as Maranza, some yes, and there's also the question of gender. Gender also plays a role here. And in terms of religion also, there are some trap groups who, there's a very famous one, it's called Seven Zoo. They are second generation Italians. And actually they do not post, I mean, many things about religion, but one time they did post stories about them celebrating their own Ramadan, for example, And also this band, they had an album launch in one of Milan's most iconic piazzas, main squares. And basically the municipality said for security situations, security concerns, they could not. But they disobeyed, and they asked all their fans to go there. And for me, that is a breach in the civil order. They are performing something. They are saying to the municipality, this is our city, so we're going to do the album launch in the main square, even if you say it's forbidden, So yes, I mean, radical in that sense. I don't know if I've answered.
Do you want to share something more, Jose Manuel, after that participation?
No, thank you very much, Beatriz. It was very clarifying. So you understanding, like, radicalism is kind of a process or a set of process in which the boundaries of what we are understanding ourselves as part of a community or a public sphere or civil society are being pushed. It's something like that. I think, no. I think that's a very interesting, a very good way in which to conceptualize this. And probably what you have said before about how the media frame these groups, it's more it's part of what you are calling radicalization more than radicalism. You know, media try to put these groups as radicalized groups, but you are trying to understand it not as radicalized, but as radical groups in this sense of the word that you are using. I think that's very interesting. You were so clarifying with your answers, so thank you very much. No, I don't have any other question, Nadia. I think we have a space for the audience to participate.
Yes, thank you. Okay, I do have a question. I would like to hear from you, Jose Manuel. How would you describe? It's very interesting to me to listen to Beatriz talk about these different concepts. I don't think that in Latin America, radicalismo is as common. I've heard more people talking about radicalización, as Beatriz was saying, like the process. But I would like to hear your thoughts on how would that work in the Latin American context to understand current current events and youth specifically. And then I would like to hear more of your thoughts, both you, Beatriz, and Jose Manuel, on the role of religion, like the role of religion within youth and the way of like participating in public life and the polarizing discourse that are surrounding both youth and religion, how they match or they relate to each other. I also have a couple of questions from the audience, so let me put them on the table too, so that you can choose how to go about it. There's one question here. Religion seems to be a force of radicalization and polarization. Shouldn't we get rid of it or limit its social and political power? Ooh, okay. There's another one that says, what is the role of religion in radicalización and polarización? Then, to what extent is civil sphere theory adequate to explain forms of radicalism that emerge precisely outside or against the liberal idea of civil society? And how can we study radicalism without pathologizing it, romanticizing it, or neutralizing and emptying it of its meaning? So I gave you a lot of questions. You can choose how to go about them. Who wants to go? Beatriz?
Okay. No, there were a lot of questions. Very interesting. Okay, maybe I start with the last one because I use civil sphere theory. So, so I think it is an encompassing theory because first it's a theory that is rooted in cultural sociology, not sociology of culture. So it is not a sociology that studies, I mean, it also considers cultural production. It's part of it, but it's not the main the main idea. It's a sociology that posits that meaning is at the basis of all social life. So it is encompassing right from the start because you're not looking merely at political and security frameworks, structures, etc. You go after the meaning. So what is a radical performance communicating? What are the symbols? What are the collective representations? And civil sphere theory, it's an encompassing theory of civil society that posits that there are binary structures of motives and relationships. So everything civil sphere works in these binaries. And it considers that solidarity is at the basis of the civil sphere. It's the main relationship. But however, solidarity needs to be articulated symbolically, and that's why you need institutions, regulative and communicative. In my work, I focus on communicative institutions. But the fact that you consider communicative and regulative institutions already gives you a very, very encompassing theory. So you're not merely analyzing the subjects who may be radicalizing or not. So you're not, because I think both pathologizing the phenomenon and pathologizing the individuals is a risk. You can't pathologize people who you think are radical or becoming or radicalizing, etc. So when I chose a theory for my project, I've tried to look upon that to not be redundant, to not be reductive. So a theory that gives me both the framework, non-civil spheres, civil sphere institutions, and then I introduce a microsociological lens, I think that can be useful. I do not think that Jeffrey Alexander's theory is complete. I think that maybe the concept of agency is not so present in the theory. So that's why I've chosen the case study of urban youth radicalism, because there I can see the agency of the youth. I mean, but no theory is complete. So I think there are many cultural sociologists who also provide interesting insights. For example, there is a sociologist, Danny Kaplan, who talks about the performance of relationships and collective intimacy. But I mean, and also Eva Illouz, the French sociologist, focuses on the sociology of emotions. Those are insights that can be included in a wider framework, I would say. So that's my answer.
Is there anything you would like to add, Jose Manuel?
No, I was thinking on the general questions, on your question, Nadia, about how we are thinking from Latin America, the concept of radicalism. In Latin America, we have a strong tradition of this label, of this a political tradition. The 19th and the 20th century, in several countries, the word was used by some political parties in a positive way. So we have the radicalismo in Argentina, for example, the radical party in Argentina, and in other countries also. And it was used, this label, to try to show how some political forces were trying to radicalize democracy, to expand the limits of democracy to include people that was outside of it. So, for example, radicalism was a strong liberal force that tried to push the limits of the vote of the election to try to make everyone capable to vote in Argentina, or they defend the public education at the beginning of the 20th century. So we have a strong historical tradition of the use of this word. But today, I think that the use of the word have changed. We are using it to try to understand, in political science in general in Latin America, to try to understand how some groups are expanding or are trying to push the limits of the democracy, not necessarily in an inclusive way, but also in an exclusionary way. So radical groups can be groups that are trying to include some new kind of rights in the democracy list of rights, like sexual and reproductive rights or other kind of rights, or they are trying to exclude these rights, to shred the limits of democracy. So we are using the word radicalism not in a positive or in a negative sense of way, but more in a descriptive sense of way. Radicalized groups are confronting directly the limits of democracy, both trying to strengthen it or to make it shorter. So we are distinguished now. There's a very popular way to think in political science nowadays that is that dialogues a lot with what Beatriz was trying to conceptualize it, with this distinction between radicalism and radicalization. We're not using radicalization, but we're using extremism instead of that. So radical groups are trying to push the limits of democracy, and some of those groups are more extremist groups. So they use violence, but not every radical not every radical group will use violence. Only the extremist of them. So that's one way to answer that question. And what about the other question was about religion? I don't really think that religion polarizes society. I think that the way in which religion is used and mobilized can be a dimension of polarization, but also religions can be understood or expressed as other things. For example, there are expressions of religions that are not radicalized expression or extremist expression, but they are expression of religions that try to build community, that try to build solidarity, that try to build a world in which everyone can be part of it. So I don't think that religious per se is have a polarization, a polarized dimension. It can be a part of the polarization of society, or it can be part of how societies respond to polarizes tendencies, polarization tendencies. But saying that, it is obvious, it is very obvious in the case of Latin America that we are experiencing a process in which some sectors of some religious groups or churches are trying to polarize and radicalize our democracies. I'm talking about some extreme or radical right evangelical groups, or some radical right Catholic groups that are using and mobilizing religions to question some of the pillars of our democracy. That is a fact, you know, but that is not the fault of religion. That is the fault of that is how religious groups are using religions to do that. You know what I mean? So I really think that we can we can try to solve this like moving religion from a public sphere, but because that will not happen. Jose Casanova said that 20 or 30 years ago, and that's a fact. Religions will not disappear from the public sphere. Religions have a public dimension, but what we have to try to think is how we can move religious expressions from a polarized frame to a more solidarity and community building frame. I think that is what we have to think about.
Thank you so much, Jose Manuel. And that relates to another question that we just got in the comments. People are asking if we can talk a little bit more on other terms such as extremism. Talk more about the difference we see between concepts, specifically radicalism, extremism, polarization. And then there's another comment, a question that's asking, does the radicalization of a group necessarily imply that it becomes uncritical and tends to be authoritarian? So there's a lot of concepts that I would like to hear your thoughts on how to create nuance and understanding of its differences. We have radicalization, polarization, extremism, authoritarianism. Is there anything you want to say about that, Beatriz?
Yes, but I also wanted to say something from before, if I can still add something, if it's still okay. No, I just wanted to say very briefly that regarding religion in the European, let's say, public space, I mean, the big debate now is, I mean, for some years has been Islam, but related to terrorism. What I think that is missing in the perspective is that I think we are missing on new spiritualities and on how youth live religion now. And because, okay, this, for example, in my case study, the second generation Italians, many of them are Muslim, etc. But I think thinking about radicalism, religion, and polarization, only keeping in mind the traditional categories of religion is a mistake, because youth are sacralizing other things which are not necessarily religious, and rituals can also be found in political settings, in artistic settings, etc., etc. So, for example, in my case study, youth, for example, they sacralize their own neighborhoods, and this becomes a part of their identity. So I think that when thinking about religion, public space, and in this case, youth, which is the topic of today's conversation, I think it's important to see religion beyond what is traditional. And I think that is something that is missing in research on radicalism, religion, and youth. And basically, regarding the categories and regarding extremism, you were saying, there is actually an author who makes a very good distinction between radicalism and extremism, which is Böttischer. There is an article from 2017. So it basically enunciates 10 key elements that separate both phenomena. And he frames radicalism as something that, so radicalism uses political violence on a pragmatic and discerning basis. So there is a positive, future-oriented narrative for society. Radicalism may be emancipatory, and it's not necessarily anti-democratic in nature. It may also be concerned with human rights. And this is the opposite in the case of extremists. This is just one academic contribution. I don't know if the professor wants to add, but yes, there's some literature that focuses on this distinction between radicalism and extremism. But again, these are very, let's say, closed concepts. I think that there are already many distinctions. I think the challenge is to have other frameworks to analyze them, because the distinctions are there and they can be useful. But I mean, move beyond those frameworks, add something else.
Right, and then there's the other part, which is like the subject's relationship to those concepts. How, like, I wonder how many of these young people will consider themselves radical, or what would they mean by it? The same thing happens, for example, in political movements in Latin America. As Jose Manuel was saying, there was a time after 2016 in which feminist groups and like a lot of leftist groups, like leftist youth in Latin America, South America specifically, and then Central America would like approach radical as a way of more like talking about their struggle, their fight. And then it was a disputed term because like radical feminism and trans exclusionary feminism entered like the discussion and the conversation, and disputing the meaning of what radical means. And right now I would say that it's more like a controversial topic, and not a lot of people would consider themselves radical. But I don't know, I'm thinking out loud on the concept and how it relates to people differently. Jose Manuel, is there something you would like to add to this discussion, or to what Beatriz was just saying?
No, I really agree with you, Naya. I think that this is a disputed term. It can be used in several ways, and the turf example that you mentioned is excellent to understand that some groups are describing themselves as radicals, while other groups say, okay, they are not, they don't have nothing radical because they are more conservative than us, which, in some ways. I'm talking about a feminist, so I think it is. I agree with you that it is a disputed term, and the dispute and the competition is for who is more radical in some way, at least in left groups or more progressive groups. But I think that it's really interesting. So how we conceptualize all these terms, I agree with what Beatriz was saying before. Okay, so for me at least, radicalism is how can I define it? It's more like the adoption of some political, religious, social ideas or beliefs, or positions that are kind of far removed from the prevailing or consensual ideological spectrum or from socially constructed common sense. So radical groups try to dispute the common sense, to push the limits of what is the common sense, of what is the social consensus in some specific moment. So that's, for me at least, radicalism, which I think it's connected in some ways with what Beatriz is understanding as radicalism. On the other side, polarization is another thing. Polarization for me is the multiple process by which a group of or some society divides into opposing sides with increasingly distant and antagonic positions. So it is kind of characterized by the disappearance of the moderated positions and the increase of intergroup hostility. So polarization is more a social process which can be fueled by some groups, but also can be fueled by other kind of historical process, So polarization is more a sociological, if you want to say that in that way, in that terms, a sociological process. And extremism, for me, is another thing. Extremism is the process by which a group progressively adopt increasingly violent ways of thinking and acting, symbolically or materially, eventually justifying or using violence to achieve their goals. So radical groups can be extremist or not, Radical groups can use the violence if they use the violence, they will be extremist groups. But if they don't violence, they don't promote violent discourses or material real violence. They can't be labeled as extremist groups, So I think this is the way in which I, at least, understand these three categories.
Thank you, Jose Manuel. Would you like to add anything, Beatriz?
Just on the last part, I think that actually radical groups may use violence. So both radical groups and extremists may use violence. I think they both may use violence, but what distinguishes them is the goal, basically. Why are they using the violence? But I think that radicalism may include violence. It may not, but it may also include it. Because I don't know, if you think about, I don't know, also some feminist movements, etc. Some use violence, not necessarily extremists, and also if you look at the past. But yeah, I think that, in my definition of radicalism, I say it may include violence, but it's just something I'm working on. It's a bit tricky also, but yeah, just a thought came into my mind.
so it is very interesting because that. So my question would be, what are you understanding as violence? Because maybe I'm not understanding violence the same way that you are understanding. For me, like, I don't know, burning a garbage in the street is not violent. You know. So what are you understanding? How are you understanding? Sorry, violence, Beatriz?
Yes, I'm not. Yeah, for me, I don't think violence is simply, you know, kicking someone or hitting someone. I think it can also be a performance in the public space, like you were saying now, like burning something or whatever. Because I don't know, I think violence can also is something that can be performed in order to get a reaction from someone. And I don't know, I think maybe I put violence more generally, you know. Yeah. But thank you for the question. No, it's important also how to conceptualize violence, because another concept that is very much related to radicalism and radicalization. Yeah.
No, thank you for your answer, because it's very interesting. Maybe we have now we're having a cultural gap. Maybe in Latin America we are understanding violence in a different way in which in Europe you can understand violence. I'm thinking aloud, but maybe for us some levels of what in Europe can be considered violence are part of a normal protest. You know, it's just an hypothesis, but maybe that can be something that make a gap in how are we understanding violence.
I don't know. I'm for me, like I'm thinking right now, is violence always relational? Like I'm thinking about it. Like if you are in a protest and you crash some windows, you know, is that violence or not? Does violence always need the relational element? So I'm hitting someone or etc. No, that's also a good question for future research to. Yeah, but you would say that a normal protest, like conceptually speaking in Latin America, what would be violence in a protest for you? That's my question.
I don't know. Violence. I don't want to talk about all Latin America, you know, but I'm living in Argentina, and I was born in Chile. In Chile, it was kind of normal that every protest end with a persecution from the police to the people in the protest, you know, and it is normal in the sense of not is what we expected. It is normal that it happened every day, you know. In Argentina, it is not that normal, but I don't know. To burn a garbage is something like that could happen, and that could be normal, you know. So I don't know. I'm going to think about that that also. What is violence for us, you know?
Right. And this opens the door to so many other conversations that go like we could talk about like narratively or like on in like political discourse, who gets to name what extremist looks like, who like the extremists, for example, as I think you were saying something like that, Beatriz, and in many places, specifically in Europe and in North America, it can be like a highly racialized term, the way we use it, the way we talk about who is an extremist. Um, it's also like this conversation about the monopoly of violence and which violence is necessary or moralized by the state versus which one is like valid in protest, and political violence, institutional violence, interpersonal violence. There's so many conversations to have, and youth is in the center of it all, disputing the meaning of those concepts, and it's placing political the political sphere, right? Like youth is always like in the center of these conversations because they're participating in public life, and ex experiencing that and sharing that in social media and contributing to the public discourse. So there's so many things to talk about, but unfortunately, we have run out of time. So I would like to know if any of you have like some closing thoughts that you would like to share, any things that you might want to put on the table before we leave.
No, I just wanted to thanks Beatriz for sharing your research. It was so interesting for me. I learned a lot from you in this hour. So thank you very much, and thanks Claxo for this opportunity in this space. And thank you, Nadia, for moderating this.
Thank you so much. Beatriz, is there anything you would like to add?
No, I would like to thank you both. Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Nadia. Thank you, David, also for inviting me to be here. No, I think that academia should have more of these moments of intercultural dialogue, and also to, sometimes speaking informally, informally/formally about our research topics can be very fruitful. And I think that academia needs more of that. So yes, and thank you, Claxo.
Thank you, Claxo. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Samir. Thank you for joining us. Bye, friends.